Well, thank you everyone who has joined today. My name is Heidi Johnson. I'm the Director for Behavioral Economics here at the Financial Health Network. And we are so thrilled to be sharing with you today a few case studies of companies that have used behavioral insights to design savings innovations. I think this is going to be a really great illustration of kind of the power of behavioral insights, because both of the companies you're going to hear from have pretty relatively light lift, light touch kinds of innovations and interventions. But I'll give you a little spoiler right up at the top. They had big impact. We saw really positive results. And so we're just very excited to have the chance to share that with you today. A few quick logistics on our platform here as we get started. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with Zoom at this point, but we really want to encourage you to use that question and answer button at the bottom there. We're going to save a nice chunk of time near the end, about 20 minutes or so, for questions from the audience. So you can feel free to drop in your questions throughout, and I'll get the chance to pose them to the panelists at the end. Everyone here is joining in listen-only mode, but if you'd like closed captioning, you can click that button at the bottom of your screen. And then just a quick reminder on our antitrust policy. We want to have a very open conversation here today between the audience and our panelists, but just keep in mind and be attentive to Financial Health Network's policy to always abide by both the spirit and the letter of antitrust laws. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists today, who can bring themselves back on video now and say hello to everyone here. We've got Tim Lucas, who is the Director of Research at SaverLife, and Naeem Kabir, who is an applied behavioral scientist, applied scientist and software engineer at Even. So welcome to the both of you.
Thank you.
We're going to get started just diving right in with very quick introductions to who you are, what it is that you worked on through this process. But I first want to send a nice thank you to MetLife Foundation, who funded the program that you both participated in through these savings interventions. So thank you to them for their support. So why don't we start with you, Kabir, introducing kind of what Even is and how your work connects with savings.
Sure. So Even is an employee benefit that is kind of distributed as a mobile application. So we get to sit between employees and their employers. That means that we connect to things like time and attendance, but also pretty crucially payroll. So like we can give you a couple of superpowers, like, we can tell you what your projected pay might be, but we can also route your paycheck where it needs to go. So like one of those uses is, hey, if you've earned some money, you should be able to get that early. We can do that for you. But the other natural evolution of that is, if you want to pre-commit the savings, we can commit a piece of your paycheck for you to a savings account and do that before it ever hits your bank account. So that's kind of the way that we approach savings, using that power.
Fantastic. And Tim, how about you? Tell us a little bit about SaverLife and how your work connects to savings.
Yeah, absolutely. So SaverLife is a digital platform that helps families, typically low-income families, build a habit of saving money for a rainy day. And we do that through a variety of ways, which we'll talk more about today. But generally speaking, it's through challenges and games that make savings fun. We're a nonprofit. We've been around for about 20 years, but in the last 5, we've really gone all in on technology and digital. And we now have about 500,000 members across the country.
Fantastic. So with each of you, we're going to go deep today on the savings innovation you developed. I want to make sure to touch on kind of that process of creating it, the how and the why. We'll talk about the connections between what you developed and behavioral insights and the impact on savings behavior, the really, really key piece where we were able to see together what actually happened to build balances and which was the most effective approaches. We're going to reflect on some learnings for other providers. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll save a nice amount of time for Q&A. So make sure to be dropping those into the chat as we go along. But to get started, let's just bring it back to the beginning and talk about kind of what spurred you to develop the innovation that you're going to be focusing on today? Kind of what was the process of getting that started and how did you develop it? So Kabir, let's have you go first.
Yeah, sure. So like I said, we have a lot of features at play with our application, like the schedule and projected pay thing. That's something that basically 100% of people use, which is great. Accessing your earned wages, it's something that like 70% of people use. The thing about the savings product though, is that we saw that usage typically hovered at around 20%, but that's like the ultimate end goal that we wanted our members to get to. Like we wanted them to build savings in some way. That's like a thing that we definitely wanted to hammer on in some way. So we were looking for any and all innovations that could help with adoption and uptake there. As part of the Leaders Lab program, we kind of got that wide brainstorming power for like what we could bring to bear. So it was a pretty fruitful meeting of the minds in that, hey, we know what we can do with our product, we know what levers we can pull. We gave that directly to you, Heidi, and then we worked together on figuring out what the literature said about, oh, what can you do with these levers exactly? So that's kind of the why. As for the how, the innovation was actually rather simple. You can see on the slides here the two different variants we had. In the original default version of the app, the savings feature is basically just this tab that hangs out. You're kind of expected to meander towards it at some point during your experience and then get started with the savings goal. But the innovation that was proposed by Heidi and FHN was, what if we actually presented users with a choice up front and said, hey, do you want to save right now or do you not want to save right now? And just doing that tiny thing ended up being very impactful. But that's the how.
We'll get more into that impact later, absolutely. Jim, let's turn it over to you. Kind of how is it that you came up with the idea for what you developed, and give us a kind of quick preview of what that looked like for your members.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Saver Life isn't the first organization to try out prize-linked savings, but we wanted to try. But there's many ways of doing prize-linked savings. So, for people who aren't familiar, prize-linked savings is when you save a certain amount, you have a chance to win a certain amount of money. And so, our first kind of foray into that was a competition. It's like a weekly competition where if you save $5, you have a chance to win $5. But we decided that we wanted to really mess with different like rates of savings or goals. So we launched a race to 500, and the idea was to launch it in September and see if we could get people to save $500 by Thanksgiving, with different sort of prize tiers within that. So it was really just like us trying to play with different things. And then while we were at that, and I think you can go to the next slide on this one. While we were at that, we wanted to also play with how we were messaging the race, and how we were encouraging people to keep up with it. And this was kind of us thinking, look, we have several 100,000 members, several tens of thousands of members who are going to participate in this race, and our team is like 20 people. So we don't necessarily know the very best way to communicate to those members, and so we were like, let's just come up with a few different personas. Let's message people who enter the race in different ways about how they should, to try to motivate people to reach these savings goals, and kind of just see what happens. So you can kind of see the three personas here, and there's an example of the text message that we sent the second week of the competition. So all of these messages have a pretty similar underlying message, which is, it's still early in the race. We've reached a certain threshold, but we still have a ways to go. And so we kind of had these three personas where the Mother Teresa version was like, you're perfect, everything you're doing is great. The Michelle Obama version was like, we're proving the doubters and the haters wrong. And we never actually even said who these doubters and these haters were. We just kind of kept saying it over and over. And then the Mr. T version was always sort of like, you're just not, like you're doing fine, but you're just not doing well enough. And what we did was we sent these out as text messages every Friday, and we were sending them using some technology where we actually have to press send on every single one. But we were sending it to a few hundred people, and it went really quickly. But what we were trying to do was mimic like a SMS technology where there wouldn't be a human at the other end. So we got responses from people, sometimes really positive, a few times really negative. But we had to remind ourselves, like, we can't react to that. And then the next slide is just another version of a different week in the race. I think this is like kind of the midway marker. So we told people in each one of these iterations, we told people that we were 40% of the way there, but what that 40% meant was very different for each one of these personas. So that was kind of the innovation that we came up with.
You know, Tim, I think a lot of companies have kind of their brand voice, you know, where they have a tone in which they typically communicate with their customers or their members or users. Was this challenging to execute? I mean, did you get any pushback on kind of using these three very different types of tones with your members?
Yeah, I'd say that the historically the Mother Teresa tone is kind of the closest to like the historical sort of Save Your Life tone and voice. I think there was some initial pushback or apprehension from particularly on the Mr. T one, especially when someone texted us back and told us we were being mean. But I think we all kind of realized like this is an experiment. It's going to a very finite number of people, and we were going to learn from it. So it made it much more palatable to roll this out when we knew it's a pretty small group of people that are actually getting the messages. So
that's a really interesting approach, kind of limiting the scale of who could have these different experiences, so there's a little bit less risk. Yeah, that's nice. I'd love to bring in kind of that behavioral component as well and kind of talk through what each of you were either trying to leverage and motivate here or trying to overcome with your different innovations. So Kabir, let's circle back to you, thinking about this active choice that you displayed in onboarding. What was that? What was kind of the barrier you were working to overcome there or that you were trying to motivate?
Yeah. So again, our big problem really was adoption. We wanted way more uptake of the savings program. And I think like the state of the art there is that opt-in versus opt-out dichotomy. Like that's a thing that worked with 401k. You go from like 37% to 86% participation, which is crazy. We can't automatically give everybody a savings account and have it be opt-out. That's like not a thing we could do, mainly because like a lot of our members, they live on the margin. We can't be saving for them automatically without their say-so. We don't know if we can do that. We also are only offered to a subset of employees. So we can't just spawn savings accounts for everybody at a particular employer. So we need something in the middle. Active Choice kind of gave that to us. We were able to say it was somewhere in the middle of that opt-in versus opt-out thing. It would give us a bit more adoption. So that kind of motivated that. There's also a little bit of evidence that just making an active choice increases your commitment to a particular program in a way that where an opt-out program doesn't. Like programs that are opt-out generally, like you don't really have a lot of say in it, and so you don't have a lot of skin in the game. Whereas with an active choice, you've made that choice. And so like you're compelled to kind of stick with it. And well, I'll tell you later how that actually plays out with the data. The second thing that we were leveraging was kind of double dipping on the idea of loss aversion. So behavioral economics has told us that we generally fear losses more than we hope for anticipated future gains. That plays out in two ways with this innovation. So generally when you're trying to save something, like money hits your bank account and you're expected to put it away somewhere, that is going to feel like a loss to you because you've gained some cash and then like you're expecting yourself to put it away. That's like a bit of resistance that is very hard. We want to do away with that by just using automatic savings in general. And then with the active choice, we're double dipping because we're presenting you with this choice and saying, hey, you can either choose to take advantage of this great autosave program, or you could say no and lose out on the opportunity to use it, which like will spur people to be like, oh wait, I don't want to lose out on the chance to autosave, so I'll autosave instead. So it was leveraging a lot of things at the same time, even though it was like a tiny thing that you had to use.
Yeah, it was a simple implementation, right? But it's activating all of these different drivers of choices and behavior. I think that's really exciting to see. And the product itself being automated savings is kind of a nice set it and forget it, right? It doesn't require a lot of attention. But then I really like what you did to kind of get people enrolled in the first place, which is often, a pretty significant hurdle. Tim, how about for you? So really embedded in all of SaverLife's platform is this prize link savings concept. And so can you share a little bit of kind of the behavioral underpinnings of that, as well as these different tones that you were testing out with the messages?
Yeah, I mean, so the prospect of winning a pretty significant amount of money is exciting to people. I mean, I think there's been a lot of studies showing this works, and it energizes people to save money. It's partially kind of why lottery exists in the first place. Even though the odds aren't tremendous, people still like to do it. But here, there's no risk to it, right? You're putting money into your own savings account. So it's a way of just encouraging people to save more than they might have otherwise. And it's, we're serving a population of folks who are very low income. Their incomes are inconsistent at best. Their expenses are inconsistent at best. And we get asked a lot, like, so what gets that population of people to save? And there's no silver bullet. It takes a variety of different tactics, and some things work better for other people. And so, we wanted to augment our race to 500 with testing out messaging to see who did different types of messaging work better for. So we really wanted, so we thought some people would be motivated by some tough love. We thought some people would be motivated by this idea of like proving people wrong. And so, that's what we were aiming to do.
So Tim, coming into this, it sounds like you thought maybe these different tones would work differently for different groups of people, like kind of a segmentation strategy. Was there any one that you thought would be particularly successful before you saw the results, kind of that you hypothesized would be the best driver?
I didn't. I think that I think some people on our team did. I didn't really know. I didn't really have like a true hypothesis. This was also kind of an early foray into this type of testing for us. So I was just really excited that we were doing it. But I definitely know that some people on our team really thought that Mr. T was gonna win. And early on, Mr. T kind of was winning, but I think maybe that started to wear on people after a little while. So,
and we'll see how that turned out. I think folks in the audience should think about which of these you think would be the most persuasive, and then we'll show the results and see if you were right. Sometimes it can be tough to predict. And let's talk a little bit too about alternative approaches you considered, because coming up with an innovation like this isn't something that just arrives fully formed in your brains, right? There's iteration and there's considering alternatives. And I'd love for our audience to kind of hear about that process for you, like what else you considered and how it is that you landed on what you ended up with. So Kabir, how about you? What else was in the option set, or what was your process for figuring out how to hone in on what you ended up implementing?
Yeah, there are a couple of interesting options. Again, many of them brought to the table by you. Thank you. But like one of the ones was figuring out what people's reference point was for what they wanted to save. So like the way that we set up savings now is, hey, you can set aside a percentage of your paycheck. Your paychecks might be variable, but we're going to set aside 3% constantly, and you can change that as you like. It's not as like we don't know if that's necessarily the right way of going about it. We could have said, oh, hey, how about we set aside money that is above this certain threshold? Like, and that threshold could be like your average paycheck or your highest paycheck so far. something like that to kind of match up with how people think about savings already. Like, I don't know if people necessarily think about saving a flat percentage. They might think, oh, hey, I have a surplus today, so I'm going to put this away for a rainy day. That might be something that makes sense. So testing out the efficacy of using those different reference points would teach us something really important about like how people think about savings in general and how we can kind of hammer on the way that they already model the world. That was really interesting. Unfortunately, the implementation of that would have been very difficult, which is what kind of wiped it off the table for us. In the same vein, like rigorously testing what the effect of having multiple savings accounts where you're earmarking for different goals was an interesting thing, because again, that's kind of modeling what people might be doing. Like, I don't know if it's necessarily true that people just think about one, omni-use savings account, a cushion for everything that could possibly happen. I think people generally, they have goals that they're trying to achieve, and they have these separate accounts for like for shuttling money into, essentially, in their minds. And if we could have tested that and figured out if that's actually how people are modeling it, it would have been useful to us. But again, it all comes down to implementation. Like, we had a bunch of great ideas, and then the exercise then was to go through and be like, okay, how much of a lift is this going to be? Like, how much complexity is this going to introduce into the product? Like, what can we reasonably do within a short time? So you basically take the ranking by impact, and then you grab the one that is the least work. That's the exercise.
And there's so much benefit to just getting started, right? So that makes a lot of sense to be prioritizing by effort there. Tim, how about you? What I recall, this was kind of an iterative process. You started in a place that was a little different from where you ended up. And walk us through kind of how you came up with the race to $500.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of iteration in getting to this test. Probably like way too much. Like, I think we probably could have. I think there's a tendency to sort of be like, oh, and we can test this while we test that, and we can test these like 6 other things. And what we ended up sort of doing is paring it down and saying, look, we can test all of those things at some point or another. And many of the ideas that we had at that time, we've actually gone on to test. But the race to 500 itself was just sort of us checking our assumptions that we had to do small savings thresholds for our member base. We were doing this kind of like, you have every week you save $5, you have a chance to win $5. And the odds are actually pretty good of getting that $5. And that's good, because what we see is people who do win that $5 tend to be pretty engaged on our platform after that. But I just remember I had just flown home from a conference, and I was telling my Lyft driver about Saver Life, and I was like, yeah, so if you save $5, you have a chance to win $5. And his response was like, $5 isn't a lot of money. And I was like, okay, fair enough, fair enough. And so we were like, well, what if we had a longer race that was like several months long? Maybe that helps smoothing out issues around income volatility. But what if we raise the bar a little bit? But what if the prize was a lot bigger? So it was just kind of checking our assumptions on like what could work for our member base. And I think what we've seen is that this type of challenge works better for some of our members, whereas like the $5 scratch and save works better for some others. So that's kind of what that was. And then as we were kind of planning out how we wanted to do this messaging component on top of it, we were like, well, what if we made it like a group race? And that's kind of where you see in these texts like the use of the word we, which is something that we historically haven't done too much. But then we were like, well, that could be really confusing and hard to administer. So why don't we just focus more on the tone? And so we kept the we there. And one thing I should point out in this is like, I don't actually know if we were 40% of our way to $10 million or not at that point. We just kind of made it up. And that's okay, because it was just a test, and there was like no huge outcome from that. So it really was just testing messaging. But so yeah, we were like throwing everything but the kitchen sink into it at first, and we were like, nah, let's just kind of focus in on two core things that we want to test: a different prize structure altogether, and tones for encouraging people to reach that prize level.
I think that's so exciting to think about. How can a test like this help you figure out how to push the envelope with your product? Or as you said, test those assumptions that are kind of baked into what you're already offering. And it sounds like it also generated a nice research agenda for you to kind of keep moving forward once you tied off this particular one. So let's talk then about what happened, right? Like what was the impact that each of you saw? And we're gonna pull up some charts here so that you can kind of share what that looked like for each of you. So Kabir, once you implemented this active choice, what was the impact? What did you see?
Yeah, so we had these two groups, treatment and control, and what we wanted to figure out was what was the impact on uptake, and then the actual ultimate outcome was what was the impact on durable balances. So the big headline would be 31% boost in uptake, which was sweet, and then a 42% boost in your balances at the end of the day. And that's just something we saw from the intervention itself. This is something we studied 8 months after the actual intervention itself, but we didn't stop watching. Like I think now, 14 months or so later, we're still collecting data, and we've learned a couple of other things here. So you know how I mentioned that active choice is like a possibility that it might increase your commitment to savings, and that might be a particular outcome. We took a look at those folks who we could like infer statistically that had been convinced by the intervention to start saving. We took a look at them specifically and found that they actually had higher savings balances than the savers from that same treatment group. Like generally there's like a contingent of people who would have always saved regardless. Like you prompt them and they'll do it earlier, which is great. But they would have eventually found their way to the savings piece of the app and done it. And there's that contingent of people who we actually convinced. And those folks, they actually saved harder and faster than the others, which is super interesting, because that validates the idea that this active choice messaging actually does mean that you have some kind of skin in the game. We don't know the exact mechanisms behind it exactly, but that was something astounding to us. Like it wasn't just this uptake from presenting it. It was like it made you commit more, which is incredible, and that's a design principle we could use elsewhere, possibly.
Yeah, it's so exciting to see these impacts kind of flowing on over time, and ones that you weren't even necessarily initially looking for, but were able to explore further. You know, one Kabir that isn't on the slide here, but I know that you even were really paying attention to, is what someone's experience was through onboarding, kind of conversion into finishing that process. Since it's always a little touchy, right, to add something into onboarding, there's a lot of trade-offs you're making there. So what were you seeing as you kind of added this new piece of the process?
Yeah, this is definitely an important thing. Yeah, onboarding is contentious. Like you have a bunch of different features in your product and you don't know which one gets a spot in onboarding, whether or not it should be in there at all. Like a lot of product design is like this golf where you're trying to make onboarding as short as possible so people can use the product. But we kept track of that. We kept track of how many people started onboarding and how many people dropped off midway through the process. And this active choice to start saving was at the very end. So we were able to tell, you know, how many people were dropping off because of this new extra screen. Like, was it that much friction that people just didn't want to engage anymore? With this particular variant of the savings feature, nobody dropped off. We didn't see any impact on that at all. Everybody just went through the flow and started using it.
So
very little downside.
To add to onboarding, a really, really helpful lesson.
Yeah.
Tim, let's turn to you and see what happened with the race to $500 and with those different text messaging tones. Everyone keep in mind what your prediction was, and Tim can share how it actually turned out.
Yeah, so yeah, important to keep in mind that this was really two experiments in one. So the two columns on the far left were just the race to 500. We had a control group of people who we never invited, and then we had a treatment group that was everyone who we invited. And so we saw really, we are very happy with the results of how much we saw increases in savings deposits for those people who we invited. I think it just, we've seen how it increases engagement on our platform. And I think the more that we're keeping savings top of mind for people, it's getting them to, save more. But then the second experiment was for people who, beyond being invited, it was people who signed up for the race. There's a baseline for everyone there, and then the treatment was the people who we added on the text messages for. And so what we found was that kind of empowering tone, the Michelle Obama tone, where we were taking on the haters or proving the doubters wrong. That just seemed to resonate. It was kind of the clear winner. And like I kind of alluded to before, the Mr. T tone, the more commanding voice, that had early signs of winning, but that, like in the first couple of weeks, but maybe it was a little bit too much for people over the course of several weeks, and so that didn't end up netting out quite as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and I think some of these are a little bit surprising just because of the magnitude of the differences, right? I'll share that from the perspective of behavioral science, messaging we know can be impactful on people's behavior, but it's often not a large magnitude impact. When I look at these numbers, Tim, were you surprised by kind of how much that was moving people around in terms of their savings deposits?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. But these people were chosen at random from those groups to receive those messages. So yeah, I was pretty surprised at the magnitude of these, for sure. I was most surprised that the supportive messages didn't necessarily win the day, or like trailed as much as they did. Especially since that's kind of historically like our sort of our brand voice. But I think it opened our eyes to the idea that we serve a very diverse community of people. There's people in all 50 states, suburban, urban, rural, across the political spectrum. And so, it's important to remember that people have different values and different things will resonate with people differently. So.
And we can't always plan on or predict it. So I think this really calls for the value of the testing and piloting that you were doing to kind of learn something that was a little unexpected. I want to talk about the process of how you each uncovered these learnings, because I think that's really key, right? Companies are doing all kinds of different methods to figure out what the financial impact of their innovations are. And both of you were using this very rigorous kind of controlled testing approach. So I'd love for you to kind of share with folks what that looked like in implementation. Starting with you, Kabir, show us kind of what that randomization scheme looked like and how you rolled out the pilot.
Yeah, sure thing. So we had this recruitment period where we knew we were going to be like rolling out this experiment and sorting people into the two different groups. So we have like a pretty baseline rate of people coming into the app week over week. So we just chose 1 week and we're like, okay, cool. We're going to be recruiting participants into this experiment during this 1 week to try and keep the two groups as similar as possible. So what we would do is people would come into onboarding. In the app itself, they would download it and then start it up, and then we'd sort them into two groups. The first one was the control group. This is like the default experience. So you come to the app, if you get sorted into the control group, it's a 50-50 chance. You'll just kind of land on the default screen, which is like our Earn tab, where you can look at your schedule and things like that. And then what we hope happens eventually down the line is that you find your way to the Save tab, and then you enroll in the automatic savings program in some way. And the second leg, you could also be sorted into the active choice group. So what happens here is at the very end of onboarding, instead of being landed on that default screen, we present you with that choice right then and there. We say, hey, do you want to save towards a goal right now? Or do you not want to save right now? Like you have to choose one of the two to proceed. And if you don't want to save right now, that's fine. You'll just land back on the dashboard screen, and maybe you'll eventually find your way in the Save tab again and enroll. or you make the choice to engage right then and there, and we take you straight to automatic savings enrollment, launch that account for you, and get you started on saving with your next paycheck. So like we're trying to keep these two groups of people as similar as possible so that any comparisons that we make between them are valid at the end
They
of the
were
day.
all new users in the same period of time, you know, kind of similar in all ways that you would expect, except this different experience.
Exactly.
Yeah, good. Tim, walk us through what this looked like for Saver Life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I spoke to this a bit, and I think I'll try to address the question that came in. But so we invited a huge percentage of our member base to the race. We held out a statistically significant number of people from those email invitations to the race to 500. Many enrolled in the race, not all. And so that's kind of the treatment and control for the first, was who got invited versus who didn't. Then within the people who enrolled in the race, the vast majority of those people were in the race only. And to address the question in the audience question was, yes, they did get messages about the race to 500. It was a handful of emails throughout the race, showing where they were individually and showing how much time was left. And so those were emails that I think we sent every couple of weeks throughout the race. I don't remember exactly. But then the additional messaging was actually SMS. So sort of a sub test here was our use of text messages to drive savings. We hadn't done a lot of that, and we were a bit concerned that we were kind of over people. So one thing we wanted to look at was kind of like unsubscribe rates from text messages as sort of a secondary metric. So yeah, so the race only people got some emails throughout the race here and there, but the blue boxes on the bottom row got text messages every week in addition.
Yeah, and I'm curious for each of you, you know, this kind of controlled testing where you've got this control group and only some are getting invited to participate in this pilot. How new is this for you? Is it something that you've been doing before at your companies, or was it a relatively novel approach? And any challenges you faced in kind of getting that off the ground? Kabir, why don't we go to you first?
I would say thankfully it's kind of, so I wouldn't say that it's standard practice to do this kind of measurement of like outcome variables, but like generally in engineering, it's kind of standard practice to test out whether or not a new rollout of a feature like will get you a bunch of errors, for example, or if they cause a negative outcome that you weren't necessarily expecting. So like the framework and everything, thankfully, was already kind of in place. Like you have a robust testing framework anytime you have a software product. It's just, you need to leverage that for doing this kind of science rather than, mitigating risk. But thankfully the framework was there and in place.
And so just something you can build on by looking at things like these financial health outcomes and savings balances, right? Yeah. Tim, how about for you? How new is this?
Like sort of new. So I think the thing we did a lot of kind of subject line testing historically in things like MailChimp for email. So, but that's like randomization that happens within that piece of software. We had done a little bit of other tests, but I think this was like the kind of the largest scale one and definitely the most visible. And it was the first time that it's the first time that we took sort of a product feature and tested like a new feature on top of it. So we had done it, but I think this was a kind of a huge leap forward for us, just to show that we could do it and it wasn't all that hard. And now it's pretty standard practice for us.
I love that, getting started and then now you can just keep going with it. So we're going to start addressing some of these audience questions that have been coming in just a moment. Thanks for folks who have gotten started there. And others, feel free to keep popping them into the chat. But before we get there, I'll just ask each of you to share kind of what happened next, right? Like what is this something that you're still doing? Does this innovation, is it still available for your members and for your users? So Kabir, what was kind of the next thing that happened?
Yeah, so based off of initial results, like after the experiment was running for 2 months or so, like they were so robust already that we just straight up launched it for essentially everybody that month. The thing that made the real world impact difficult to measure, though, was that we launched it in April of 2020, which is also when like lockdowns were happening. So it's very difficult to tease apart those compounds. But thankfully, we had the experiment to show us what the actual impact was, independent of anything that was happening outside. But yeah, it's still something that is in onboarding to this day. We may want to experiment again, but it's there.
That's great. So you were able to scale it up and just roll it out once you saw those impacts.
That's right.
Tim, how about you? Is the race to $500 still around?
No, sadly, but the race to 100 is, and it's around every month. So each month we kind of announce a new race. I think almost every month we announce a new race. And we are still continuing to test different ways of messaging it to some subsets of people. So we're starting to do more like personality profile testing. So encouraging people to save in the race based on kind of what we know about their personalities. So that's in the works as we speak. And then we're just continuing to try to test messaging in a variety of different ways. We did some testing towards the end of last year, and we published it maybe a month or two ago. When people signed up, we looked at their existing savings balance, and we gave them like a 1 month savings goal to really kind of boost their savings when they joined, based on what their starting balance was and what we've seen in the data historically about like what is achievable for people, to try to get more people to like get that jump start. We're also testing things around automation of savings. So while our platform doesn't have an ability to automate people's savings, what we're trying to do is use messaging to say, hey, here's how you turn it on for your bank and for your savings account. So we're continuing to like test, and the races are still running, and yeah.
Fantastic. Good. Well, let's dig into some of these great questions that we've been receiving. Two that I want to tie together are, Kabir, there was a question about Even's availability is that just for employees of member businesses and employers? But as you address that, could you also speak to a question about kind of what it really means for especially a low income population to save? Like, how is that even possible? Is it maybe just preparing for expenses rather than building up a balance? And what does Even see as you speak about kind of who participates in Even?
Yeah, I can take both. So as far as who we're available to, yeah, it is true. Like we are available just for the employees of the employers we integrate with, and that's because we want to provide this like very reliable experience where you know what hours you're going to work, because like we're getting that directly from your employer. You know exactly what you're going to get paid and what you should have access to, because we're getting that directly from the source of truth. So that's generally how we do the work. As far as what it means to save for a low-income population, that's a great question. So this isn't necessarily a long-term savings thing. This definitely is not a 401k. Regardless of your level of income, though, like everybody is doing some amount of buffering. Like you don't spend down something as soon as it hits your bank account. Generally, like you keep it around and you wait to see what kind of obligations you have coming down the road. So this is kind of designed to help with that. It's designed to help you automatically build up that buffer that you can spend down as necessary. Like we don't think of it as a failing to spend down that savings balance. That's you using savings how it's meant to be used, right? It's like this cushion that's meant to be squeezed every once in a while. But that's keeping you healthy. It's like, as long as you're not going into the red, like you're using that pretty well. So that's how we think about it. Like, again, our goal for what should be in your cushion is like a $400, $500 thing, to like deal with the medical expense, to deal with like weird weather patterns that happen and like wreck your car or something. I don't know. There's a bunch of stuff that just a small cushion can help with. And that's generally like how we're thinking about it. We just want you to build up that cushion so that when something strikes, disaster strikes, you're not caught unawares. You have something to help you out.
Tim, I saw you nodding along to that. Is that how you think of it at Save Your Life as well?
Yep. Yeah, totally. So I think we've had this, yeah, I'm just going to basically say the same thing you just said, but we had this like kind of internal debate happening for a long time around what should we really be focusing on? Is it the habit of savings or is it savings balance? And I think where we sort of landed is the answer is yes. Like the habit is massively important. But then when we actually pose the question to our members, like what does saving look like for you? Like how do you know if you've been successful? They overwhelmingly said it's more money in my bank account. And so we're like, well, but you can't get there without the habit piece. And we also completely agree on the like, but it's there to be used type of thing. In fact, one messaging I'm really keen to test in the near future is when we see someone taking money out of savings, hitting them with messaging that's like, that's awesome, you did it. You know, you had that savings, like you had it and you were able to use it. Congratulations. Now let's get back after it, you know? So yeah, we look at it very similarly.
To celebrate spending savings. That's great.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing? I think it's super sweet because I think Mariel Beasley actually did a presentation a while back on like the impact of thinking of savings as this inviolable thing that you can't spend down. Like people end up taking out credit card debt instead of using savings that's already there. So I think it would be hugely impactful to just encourage it. Be like, yeah, that's great. Like you're using this thing for like what you need it for. It's better than running up debt for sure. I think it's important.
There's a question here about segmentation that I'm interested in. I'm curious if each of you are able to, first, can you see kind of who is salaried versus, kind of living more paycheck to paycheck with wages that may vary over time? And have you seen differences in financial savings behavior from folks who have different income experiences like that?
Yeah.
All right. So we can see it for a large percentage of our member base. But like people they only link one financial institution to Save Your Life, so it's kind of hard to see because a lot of times people are in households where there's numerous, and so there's income from an employer, but there's also sending money to other people in the family or receiving money, and then people were working all sorts of different jobs. But I think what we have seen is, we've done a lot of polling on this as well, where we ask people about how much their incomes can fluctuate in any given month, and it's pretty rampant. And then we also ask them, the degree to which they feel like they're able to save consistently, and it's very clear that people with higher levels of income volatility struggle to save more. Especially given that they often have to take money out of savings to cover in months when there are dips in their income. So yeah, we're firm believers that income volatility is a huge impediment for people being able to increase their financial stability.
Yeah, we definitely see the same thing, basically. We also have done the salaried versus hourly cut of our data to see what happens. And we actually get really counterintuitive results with our program, at least. Like for our specific, hey, you can automatically save through your employer with your paycheck, that kind of thing. We actually see that hourly folks, and in particular lower income folks, engage more with the product, which is strange. And we don't know why that happens. Like it might be because salaried folks or higher income folks have more alternatives to savings programs. Like maybe they do a split deposit already or something like that. Hard to say. It may be true that lower income folks don't, trust or engage with your traditional financial institutions as much. That might be another thing. But even though we have higher engagement with that population, the efficacy is flipped. Like if you are salaried or if you have higher income, you generally can save better than if your hours are volatile or if your pay rate is lower.
Makes a lot of sense. I'm interested in this question that was posed about cost, because I really like to hold up both, even in Savor Life, as kind of exemplars of taking on the leadership to develop new innovations and putting in the effort to testing them out. How much effort are we talking about, right? To kind of conceive of and design these experiments, to implement them. What should others be aware of if they're considering embarking on this kind of testing and learning type of journey? Tim, what did that look like at Savor Life?
Yeah, I would say it's incredibly low cost. I think that we're using, SMS technology that you can buy. Depending on how much of it you're doing, it's not that expensive at all. I think people can start doing it very, very quickly. And again, you don't have to test these things on your entire audience. You test them on just enough of your audience so that you can trust the outcomes of it. And then in terms of like the effort level internally to put this experiment together, the real challenge is getting out of your way of making perfect the enemy of the good. A lot of times we just have to say, you know what, we are trying to solve every problem at this conference table or this Zoom meeting, and we don't need to do that. Let's just minimize the question to one core question, and let's put something out there and see what results we get. Most of the testing we do right now, practically speaking, is like an hour or two of discussion at most, and like $20 in cost to this SMS sending platform. So there's super low barrier to entry, assuming you have some phone numbers for your members or your clients. Super low cost to entry. And you learn so much so quickly, including things you didn't even think to ask in the first place. So I'm a huge believer that get the minimum viable product, or like the smallest question you can answer, and put it out there before you overthink it.
How about you, Kabir? Agree, disagree? Was this testing costly, easy?
This particular experiment was very easy to do. I think the main, like the biggest cost sink or time sink was actually brainstorming what we would do and how to fit it to like our product roadmap. The actual implementation piece was very simple to do. One thing I would say though is that we did kind of have the advantage of an infrastructure, like we're a mobile app, so we're like logging basically everything. Like we have databases full of information about what users are doing and how they're using the product, so we could just like leverage that, which made it very simple. I feel like without that though, that might be another cost. Like you need to make sure that you're recording data with like very high fidelity. So without that automated logging, that might cost you something. But for us, thankfully, we already do that. So it's just very simple to get off the ground.
Yeah.
I'll also add, it really makes it a lot easier if you have Heidi doing the analysis for you after the fact.
Along with a team at Financial Health Network, certainly not just me, but we do really enjoy partnering with companies to kind of augment that capacity on the analytics side wherever we can. We have just a few minutes left here, so I'm going to ask one final question to land on, which kind of goes a little bit deeper on what we've just been talking about with kind of cost and implementation. But I want to reflect more broadly beyond that, recognizing the fact that both of you are fintech companies, right? Which comes with it a certain, set of resources or skill sets or company environment, right? And a lot of folks in our audience today are coming from banks, credit unions, financial counselors, and all kinds of other institutions as well. What reflections would you have for other types of institutions? Or if you'd like to also reflect on kind of other domains, like other places where these types of findings could be used, how would you kind of think about how to translate what you did into another environment, either institutionally or maybe a different area of financial health? Kabir, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, working in tech, you just have the benefit of like being able to randomize basically for free, because you just do stuff on the back end. Like at other institutions, you'd have to be much more intentional about, oh, okay, we need to do a pilot program. How are we going to roll it out? how are you going to sort people into it? Like, it feels like it would be more of a manual process, and you'd need like a little bit of expertise into, you know, how to make sure that you're randomizing fairly and in a way that where you're learning the most. So you can't like target a specific population or a specific geography, for example. You need to figure out a way to do it more equitably and uniformly. That's like something you'll probably need expertise on. The other bit of expertise you'll probably need is like figuring out what in the literature, what in the state of the art you can bring to bear. That's something we needed too. Like FHN gave us that in the form of you, Heidi. But like you definitely need that expertise to be like, okay, what tools are out there? What can we use? And then I think the third piece would be what I just spoke about, being able to log outcomes in a way that's like really high fidelity. So if you don't have a database already tracking user behavior and things like that, you're going to need to figure out a way to write things down. I don't know whether that's going to be like, you know, a lab notebook or a spreadsheet, but it's going to have to be some like formalized system where you try and smush out as much of that error as possible. So I think those would be the pieces I'd focus on: randomization, tools that you could have, and then like logging outcomes out.
Great tips. Tim, any final thoughts on recommendations for others?
No, I think that, yeah, the randomization thing is critical. You have to be able to, like, you can't just target like your intervention at the people who are like likely to save more and just see if they save more and then like strip away everybody else or whatever. But you know, a lot of times we just use Excel has a function called rand, and it puts a random number next to it, and then you just sort that list and you take, you know, or you just do every other person on, you know, from that randomized number list. So it's doable, and I was excited to see that like so many credit unions were joining today, because we have very similar goals, and I think that these types of experiments are, you know, assuming you have phone numbers. Well, for us, it was phone numbers, but email addresses will work too. Assuming you have that, you can test out this messaging. And you know, I think one of the major hurdles continues to be like, oh, we can't send this kind of wacky messaging to all of our members. And it's like, no, we're just going to do it to, you know, 100 or 150. And so once that helps get it past that kind of scary threshold of like this being way too new, it's like the risk here is pretty low. So let's give it a shot.
So give it a shot. That's a great note to land on. I'm going to share a couple of final ways for folks to kind of continue engaging in this work as we wrap up today. We've got research reports that go deep on each of these interventions that Tim and Kabir shared with us today. So you can go to the website here. We've also dropped that into the chat so you can learn about our Leaders Lab program and all of the other work that we do collaborating with companies to apply behavioral insights. We've got a webinar coming up next month focused on our grant program for folks who are involved in the criminal justice system and trying to serve those individuals. If you'd like to learn about the grant or make a pitch, come join us for that webinar. And then in June, we'll be gathering at our Emerge Financial Health Forum, where we're going to hear from leaders in this industry about kind of recovery from the pandemic and what to expect moving forward in the goals of serving folks and improving financial health for all. So with that, I'll thank our panelists. Thank you so much to Kabir and to Tim for joining us today. It's been fantastic to partner with you and to see your leadership in this arena. And thank you all for joining today. Take care, everyone, and thanks so much.